Professor Shaun Hendy and his team at Te Pūnaha Matatini modelled Covid-19 scenarios for the government during the height of infections. And these models were absolutely crucial in shaping decisions about lockdowns, border controls and vaccination. His new book, A COVID Response, offers an insider's perspective on New Zealand's strategy against the virus and why he fears we're not ready for the next pandemic. But looking back, did we actually get it right last time round?
It's more than 5 years since COVID-19 first arrived on New Zealand's shores. So with a little bit of distance, how are you reflecting on the pandemic?
Yeah, it's been interesting looking back. It's quite a hard story to tell in a way, right? What took place, what happened. I think for a lot of people it's a blur, and then for me there's these big events that just punctuate my memory and sort of erase some of the in-between bits. So it's kind of it's interesting looking back. It's been a useful exercise, I think, for me, going back and going through my notes and just reviewing what happened, and in particular sort of trying to put down some of the key lessons that I'd learnt so that maybe the next generation can pick up and learn from those.
Yeah, although of course hopefully we don't get to that point.
Yeah.
We'll talk about some of those lessons in a moment. So the first phase of the COVID inquiry broadly commended New Zealand's response with the information we had available at the time. In what ways do you feel that public sentiment towards New Zealand's COVID response has shifted?
Yeah, I mean, I think we look back and we forget that for quite a long period of time we had a relatively normal lot of it here in New Zealand. We had those very strong lockdowns, stronger than anywhere else in the world. But overall, over those several years, we had fewer restrictions than almost any other country on average. And I think we tend to forget that. And we didn't go through the same sort of trauma that many other countries went through. We didn't have the cases early on. By the time the virus spread through the community here, we were well vaccinated, and we were also dealing with the mild Omicron variant. So I think when we look back, our memories are perhaps a little bit selective and perhaps don't fully comprehend what we avoided going through.
In your view, why wasn't New Zealand better prepared for the pandemic in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of countries weren't well prepared. I mean, and even those that you would have thought were well prepared really struggled in the face of it. And I think the world had was really focused on influenza pandemics. We had memories of 1918. People learn about that at school, and so it was that influenza that we'd planned for, and it wasn't an influenza pandemic, right? It was a coronavirus, and it had quite different characteristics, and that meant that many of the plans that we had on the shelf just weren't appropriate, and in fact we could do a lot better against the coronavirus than we would expect to be able to do against an influenza pandemic. So that was one key thing. We really had just planned for a different scenario. I mean, a second thing was that we haven't invested as much in infectious disease control and public health in New Zealand as a lot of other countries. We were weak on surveillance. That was one of the things that tripped us up early on. Our ability to identify disease in the community, and then to contact trace that and put people into isolation. People will remember the struggle that we had early on with contact tracing, even though that did improve over time. So we hadn't made those basic investments that other countries had, and that did put us on the back foot. And we did need to use the elimination strategy because of that. That was part of the reason why the elimination strategy was the obvious thing for us.
Well, it became the obvious thing, and so this is one point I wanted to ask about, and you write about this in the book. So in your initial modelling, you didn't conclude that the elimination of the virus was, even with border controls and lockdowns, a real possibility, despite what was being achieved in countries or places like Taiwan. Why was that?
We actually didn't have the tools. So in New Zealand, we hadn't developed the mathematical models that you could use to look at elimination. So we actually did think it was possible. We were looking at what was happening in Taiwan, in South Korea. We thought it was possible. We didn't have the mathematical tools at that point to really investigate it, and so that wasn't part of the initial package of modelling that we did. It took us a couple of weeks to get those tools together, but by early April we were using those tools and looking ahead to elimination.
There are a few kind of key moments that I want to ask you about as you develop those models throughout the pandemic phase. So one comes in your very initial communication. In your initial communication about the absolute worst case scenario forecast, I think it was March 2020, you talked about an absolute worst case, if New Zealand did absolutely nothing, of 80,000 deaths. How do you reflect upon your communication of that point?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I tried really hard to do was to not say 80,000. So I actually stuck to, I talked about tens of thousands versus thousands. So really, if we didn't respond effectively, then we were facing tens of thousands of deaths. And I think when we look at what happened overseas,
the paper suggested that was the absolute upper limit, right?
And so that's that's what I call the flu scenario. If we basically treated it like a bad flu.
Yeah.
And so one of the reasons you put that in your modelling is to show it's not a bad flu, because the flu doesn't cause 80,000 deaths every year. You know, something like 500. So you immediately see that what you're dealing with is not just a bad flu. And so that's why you'd have that that kind of scenario in your working, even though it's not something that you'd necessarily want to make a prediction, because of course people aren't going to react to a scenario like that as if it's the flu.
Do you think that point was well communicated?
We tried our best under a lot of time pressure, and I think initially we did okay. I mean, it later got picked up and used, almost as a piece of misinformation.
A deliberate piece of misinformation?
Yeah, or even inadvertently by people who didn't quite understand what the models were saying. And so it got recirculated. So really, I think initially people, we did an okay job getting that across. It did, that number 80,000 did appear in the headlines. But, I think people understood what was going on, but later it came to be used to discredit the modelling when it really wasn't a prediction.
One of the fundamental decisions you made with your model was that essentially all lives that would potentially be lost were essentially of the same value, right? So you opted not to define your models with a quality of adjusted life years, which accounts for age and health and that sort of thing. Why was that?
So I mean, one of the things that I think is problematic about using QALYs, or quality adjusted life years, is that it depends on people's life expectancy. So Māori have decades less life expectancy than Pākehā, for example, and so you're essentially by using QALYs, you're devaluing lives of Māori people, for example. So I don't think we have a good tool. Certainly QALYs for me don't fit that bill. For looking at infectious disease, I think we need new tools to really sort of communicate and make decisions on infectious disease.
Is that your value judgment to make?
I mean, yes, in a way, as a scientist.
Well, in a sense, though, there's also, I mean, there's an ethical element to that.
Yeah.
There's a political element to that.
Yeah. I mean, as a scientist, you've got to make your own ethical judgments, right, when you're doing your work, and that was a particularly important part of what we did, was making those ethical judgments and trying to make them clear, why we were making certain decisions and to use certain tools. So you do have that responsibility. I mean, politically, I think we've overlooked infectious disease. We haven't asked ourselves the hard questions about infectious disease. It's infectious disease. It impacts inequality. If you've got an unequal society, it'll tend to be those at the bottom of the pile who are most impacted by infectious disease. I don't think we've grappled with that in New Zealand. You use QALYs for things like lifestyle diseases, heart disease. You might use it for applying treatments, but I think they really are inadequate when it comes to infectious disease.
Well, I suppose the reason I ask is that when it comes to COVID, age is absolutely fundamental when it comes to outcomes, right? So you would surely agree, and I know that it's always very difficult to have these conversations when you're talking about qualities, but the resources that the state might pour into saving the life of a 75-year-old might not be the same as the resources the state would put into saving the life of a 25-year-old, right?
Yes.
You would agree, and there are ethical questions there, but I think most people would say perhaps the 25-year-old is worthy of more state resources in that example.
Sure.
And it's clear, is it not, that COVID was massively affecting older generations rather than younger people.
Yeah, and so that's certainly the case, and I don't disagree with that. But using a very blunt tool like Qualityadjusted magnifies inequalities in other ways. It spreads the impact across Māori and Pacific populations, for example, because they have unmet health needs in our society because of inequality, because of racism in our healthcare system. And so using a mathematical tool that appears to give you that precision, appears to kind of to deliver that kind of to balance that kind of judgment, has other impacts. And so I would rather just sort of put those numbers out there and let people make value judgments about
I got one more question on this, just because it is really curious now that we have a little bit of space to look at the different demographics of those people affected. So New Zealand currently records 2,914 deaths with COVID as the underlying cause, right? How many people would you expect were over the age of 80?
Quite a large number.
Yeah, so it's 2,066, so 71%. 71% of the people who've died from COVID as an underlying cause in New Zealand are over the age of 80. Over the age of 60, 96%. So clearly that it is massively skewed to older generations. Again, I'm not suggesting that those people aren't worth investing in and supporting, but there'll be a lot of people who say, you know what, we expended a huge amount of resource for something that actually only affected older New Zealanders, and perhaps would be better targeting our response to those generations.
Yeah, so two comments on that observation. I mean, first of all, of course, there's a large number of the people who've larger proportion of those people who have died are Māori or Pacific people. That did have a big impact on those communities. And so many of the decisions we made were to protect those vulnerable communities. And I think the second thing is, did we actually expend a lot of resource in saving those lives? And I think one of the things I've learnt looking back is actually the economic costs of letting a virus run rampant in your society, not controlling it, not being able to go back to periods of normal life, normal economic activity, are actually as large as, if not larger, than what we did, which was to use those short, sharp lockdowns to control the virus. And so I think when you do the sums, we didn't actually, relative to letting the virus spread uncontrolled, we didn't actually spend an enormous amount of money.
I guess my point is there a middle ground? Like, for example, if we had weighted the modelling to account for some of those differences in demographics, and particularly around age, could you not have had a response that said, you know what, we are going to have really strict controls around older people. They're not mandatory necessarily, but we're going to recommend to older people that since you are the likeliest to die from COVID-19, we are recommending you stay home, and we're going to have all sorts of state support to assist you in that position. Meanwhile, younger people are going to continue keeping the economy moving, younger people are going to go to school, that kind of thing. Could you not find a middle ground?
Yeah, so that's kind of the Swedish approach. And when you compare our numbers to theirs in terms of what the response cost, it's pretty much the same, if not a little bit more advantageous in our direction. The Swedes had to have controls in place for a very long time. Essentially the full 18 months. So when controls went on in Sweden, they stayed on. They didn't have the short, sharp periods of lockdowns that we did. Then they were dealing with
controls, right?
They were much milder controls, but because they were on for nearly 2 years, they cost Sweden almost as much as what we spent in our lockdowns. And then Sweden had the cost of dealing with the virus as well. As those controls. So when you add up those two costs, the cost of your controls, the cost of dealing with the virus, elimination actually comes out as a better economic strategy.
Did you feel personally responsible at all for that last big Auckland lockdown in 2021?
We've got to take some culpability for that. I think one of the things that when I look back about how we could have been better prepared and how that could have factored into our decision making, I think there were a couple of things that the science community got wrong, or at least didn't. Were perhaps fuzzier than they should have been. One was around aerosol spread. So we understand now that actually COVID-19 and most respiratory viruses are spread by aerosols. And early on, a lot of our controls were based around droplet spread. So they're larger droplets that we spread when we breathe and talk. Whereas it was actually spreading by aerosol, and aerosol can travel much further. So those 2 metre rules were not were not really adequate for protecting things. And so when we the MIQ system was designed, for example, it was predicated on this idea of droplet spread. And so we could have, the science community could have been ahead of the game on that. But at least we are now. We've got better understanding. Should this happen again, I think the types of border controls, the types of quarantine systems we'd use would be more effective. We know the importance of ventilation now as a tool for controlling respiratory disease. And I think that the second thing was around the way that the variants evolved. And this is something I think we should be putting a lot more effort into understanding. How do viruses evolve? What should we expect over a period of time? Because what got us for that 2021 lockdown was Delta. And being able to anticipate and understand that we're going to be facing these more transmissible variants in a pandemic, would have allowed us to prepare better, particularly when we had those kind of periods where we were virus free, life was sort of going back to normal. We could have made more efforts to strengthen those border controls and think harder about that. But there was a little bit of a tendency for us to go, phew, after each each outbreak and assume we were going to be able to go back to normal. But I think being better able to anticipate that the variants that were coming would have been would have helped us deal with and maybe not have that outbreak.
Like you said, a lot of memories around this are a bit blurry, but I went back and looked it up. So back in November of 2021, you were still advocating for a level 4 lockdown, and I mean that lockdown that led up to November, I mean, was I'm sure the most socially damaging of all of the lockdowns in New Zealand. So do you think your team could have been quicker to realise that elimination wasn't going to be possible with that?
So we weren't. So in November, we weren't saying we should eliminate, right? I mean, I think by November we were pretty clear that the elimination was off the
You were in
table.
September, so if it started in August, in September, sort of late-ish September, you still thought elimination was possible?
So September we were still looking at numbers that looked like we would eliminate, and of course people may remember that long tail of cases where contact tracers just couldn't get ahead of that tail of cases. And so by the end of September, we're kind of looking at a scenario where we were going to potentially have a big wave of Delta. And so that's where we thought we might need to have a short, sharp lockdown, just to bring those cases under control. And I think in the end, what happened is we vaccinated like crazy. People went out and got vaccinated. I remember it was at the Super Saturday. That was a great day for us as modellers because the vaccination rates jumped by almost 1%, right, and which had a big impact on our model. And so as the vaccine rates climbed, we became more convinced that we were going to have a softer exit from that Delta outbreak, and the need for a lockdown diminished. But I think up until that point, as we were sort of looking at those last few percent of people to get vaccinated, lockdowns for me were still something, level 4 was still something I thought should be part of our toolkit.
So that being said, even in September 2021, you said New Zealand would face approximately 7,000 deaths according to the model with a 75% vaccination rate for over 5s. So the vaccination rate today for those over 12, I realise these aren't exactly right, is 84%, and we've had just under 3,000 deaths that are directly attributable to COVID. Again, there are more deaths that might have been caused by COVID as a contributing factor. So I suppose, looking at those numbers, you could say, well, the model was out by an order of more than 100% in 2021 as a result of Delta. But is that unfair?
No, that is unfair. No, so that prediction was a long range prediction. So we were looking at what could happen over the course of the pandemic, over the coming year, so I think people did misunderstand that when we were talking about those 7,000 deaths. We were really talking about long-term projections, not what was going to happen in that Delta outbreak.
Right.
People would have been used to.
But it's still fewer than 7,000. It's less than 3,000 today, right?
And
but a higher vaccination rate.
But what happened was that Omicron came along, and so
more infectious, less deadly.
Yes,
right.
Yep. And so that really changed our modelling. When we did go back and look at how well we did with Omicron, we were about right. I mean, we were there or thereabouts as far as the modelling went.
How do you feel about Simon Thornley today?
Yeah, look at there are obviously times when I think our work was mischaracterised by some of the Plan B folk. It's always difficult when you're engaging in a scientific debate in public. It can be far more bruising. Normally scientists get together at conferences and discuss things in a much more collegial way. When you find yourself in a crisis, debating with people through the media, it becomes very difficult, I think, for all concerned. And so, I think in a crisis, there's always going to be scientific dissenters, right? Science works that way, right? You've got people who take a different view. Sometimes that view turns out to overturn the scientific consensus. Other times, the scientific consensus carries on as is.
Sometimes you're Galileo, sometimes not.
Yeah. And mostly it's not Galileo. So it is difficult when these folks pop up with their view and feel that there's a big mistake being made. But I think it's important that we behave collegially, and that didn't always happen. And certainly some of the work, some of the work that we did, I think was unfairly characterised by Simon and some of the Plan B folk. Those things are still up on their website. And don't really do justice to the work that we did, and really became forms of misinformation, which later were then turned back on us and used to accuse us of all sorts of things. What do I take as a lesson from that is actually, the scientific community needs to be better prepared. We need to have these debates before the crisis, ensure that we all understand the consensus going into a crisis. You do see this in other scientific fields. Seismology, for example, at times after the Canterbury earthquakes, there were different opinions being passed around aftershocks, for example, the risks that Cantabrians faced from ongoing aftershocks. And the solution is to really get back to basics, and as a scientific community build preparedness as a group. And so when you go into that crisis, you're not suddenly taking shots at each other.
So I've gone back and looked at some of the comments and recommendations from Simon Thornley and Plan B over the course of the pandemic, and I think demonstrably some of their predictions have been found to be incorrect. There are some things though that are interesting to reflect on with the benefit of hindsight. So in December 2020, he and his colleagues published a paper, quote, "Even if a vaccine is developed, it's unlikely to achieve elimination, since cases continue despite widespread immunisation." I think we'd all agree that was true. February 2021, they said the risks of the virus were overstated. The large majority of deaths were because of comorbidities. I mean, certainly the risk of death was found to be elevated with comorbidities. And they said that eradication was desirable but unrealistic, and that a prolonged lockdown and subsequent economic decline would have numerous other implications that weren't being properly accounted for. Do you think Plan B was right about some stuff?
Yeah, I mean, at times, I mean, and you can see them at times aligning with the scientific mainstream, but taking a different view on it. At other times, they were pushing things that were really fringe scientific ideas and not within that scientific mainstream. So yes, there were times that they were on point, and genuinely people could look at the same things and come to those different conclusions. A lot of the time, though, they were using things that were just on the scientific fringe, and so it was very difficult to engage, scientifically when some of those things are really just don't make scientific sense.
And your recommendation is that dissent is aired and those debates occur preferably before the crisis rather than in the midst of the crisis.
Yeah, so find that out in a good pandemic exercise, involving scientists, where those differences of opinion will come about.
As opposed to 2 weeks into a lockdown necessarily.
Yeah.
I appreciate that your role was focused primarily on infections and the potential for deaths and the health system in New Zealand being overwhelmed. When you reflect on our broader response, do you think New Zealand properly accounted for some of the other impacts of COVID?
Again, I think we could have been better prepared here. I mean, there was a lot of guesswork was involved, because we hadn't necessarily planned the elimination strategy and it had to be pulled together in a very short period of time. I don't think we made some of the optimal decisions. I would still say that elimination was, in many ways, the preferable strategy. And if we face another pandemic, should be certainly on the cards, and probably for most pandemics, it's something we should consider. However, the planning and preparation for that in some places was lacking. I think, an obvious area was our managed isolation and quarantine, where it took us a long time to really get those systems working. And even then, wasn't perfect, even after we've been running it for a year. But I have a lot of sympathy for the people who had to put that together, something that had never been tried really before in New Zealand. And we had massive expectations on those folks to build a system from scratch with very little preparation. So it comes back to preparing and making sure we could have we knew how to do those sorts of things in advance. Education, I think our school system. I mean, in the end, I think we did okay. I'm not an expert in that area, but we seem to have done okay relative to other countries. But we could have been better prepared. And while we did okay, I think some people probably did really poorly through some of those lockdowns. And again, being better prepared, having better social safety nets, being more quickly able to move to online learning when we needed to would have helped.
I suppose, I reflect on the start of the interview when you said that, people may be reflecting on COVID and forgetting how good we had it for a while. And I wonder if that is in part because we're still paying the bill today, both literally and, in a broader kind of social sense. I mean, attendance in schools is appalling relative to pre-COVID. And I mean, that is something that we are going to feel throughout our society and economy for generations to come as a result. New Zealand has, one of the lowest rates of economic growth in the world, or has had recently. So clearly the impacts are long lasting, and I just wonder if enough space was given to those considerations during the response. Yeah,
and I think one of the criticisms that the Royal Commission made of the response, or observations perhaps, was that we didn't pivot well from the what they called the emergency phase. So that's that's where we were dealing with active outbreaks, to thinking about what they call the crisis phase, which is what are you going to be doing over the next 2 years to make sure you emerge better from the situation. And I think that's a fair observation. The only way you'll do that better is through better preparation, I think. And so the better the preparation, the better you'll be able to deliver a pandemic strategy in coming pandemics, and we will have another one, unfortunately. So we do need to be prepared. There are lots of things we could be reflecting on, and I'm not sure if that's going on enough. We kind of, a lot of us want to forget and move on. I mean, I've written a book to try and we'll see if people want to read it or move on. But some of that reflection should be starting to take place now. I think we have had a bit of a chance to pause and sort of take stock, and some of those reflections should be coming out now. And indeed, we are looking at a world where the chances of a pandemic is increasing year on year. It's not something that's going to diminish. So we do need to take stock and learn those lessons.
So let's talk about your priorities then for how New Zealand should be better prepared for what is an inevitable pandemic in the future. You say that working with Australia is actually the obvious thing to do.
Yeah, and the Australian inquiry, the report came out before ours last year, and they're already well on the way to implementing a lot of their recommendations. They've acted much more swiftly than we have in New Zealand. And one of the things they're doing is establishing an Australian Centre for Disease Control. We should be partnering with them. We are a small country. There's only so much we can do. There's only so many scientific experts that we have to call on, and by partnering with Australia, we can call on some of that expertise. That might have been really useful for us in dealing with that emergency versus crisis phase. Might have been useful for them as well at times when they were dealing with large outbreaks, asking us to do to help out here. So I think that's something we should be doing. It is, unfortunately, we are watching the US kind of dismantle its public health at the moment. It really is quite alarming, and people won't be aware to the extent to which we relied on the US scientifically. A lot of the best science was done in the US, has been developed in the US for dealing with infectious disease. We are looking potentially at a future where that capability doesn't exist anymore. And so, countries like ours are going to have to learn to become more reliant. Things like the mRNA technology, it's looking like the Americans may walk away from that. In which case, Australia and New Zealand might have to go it alone. And the Australians and we have invested in mRNA technology, and the Australians want to be able to manufacture their own their own vaccines. And I think we should be looking to partner with that as well.
Finally, it's quite a personal reflection, right? You've managed to weave in all of the mathematical modelling and the decisions you made in your professional capacity with your kind of personal experiences throughout the pandemic, but with a little bit of space now, knowing all of the credit you received at the time, but also knowing the kind of public scrutiny and sometimes hate you got online. How has this experience affected you?
Look, it was very rewarding. I mean, I say that in the book, and overall, it was a positive experience. I mean, it was also very tiring. It was 2 years' work at full pace with very few breaks, and I think everybody in our team struggled in some way with that. Some people have coped better than others, and so it was very hard, like sustaining that level of work and the scrutiny that came with it. The media demands was very challenging when as academics, we're not set up to do that, right? It's not part of our normal job. So it was very challenging. However, what do you become a scientist for? You become a scientist to help people. And I think, reflecting on that, there won't be as big an opportunity for me, I hope, to help society that way again. It was a unique opportunity to step into a gap and do some work that was desperately needed. And you don't see those opportunities very often as a scientist. You kind of chip away at your own piece of the puzzle. You're contributing as part of a global effort, and you have to take a lot of satisfaction in your own small part of the world. And so there's very few opportunities like that come along. And so it was a privilege to be able to do that. And look, the vast majority of New Zealanders, I think, appreciate that. I do get thanked in public. Thankfully, people don't recognise me as much anymore, so I can be a bit more anonymous. But people are almost always very gracious and prepared to thank us for our work, which is pleasing. So yeah, overall, it's been a positive thing, even if I've got slightly more grey hairs now as a result.
That's Professor Shaun Hendy, and Shaun's new book is The COVID Response, a scientist's account of New Zealand's pandemic and what comes next.